Hey PE Econ class, this video series is going to be about the Phillips curve. We're going to have a three-part video series. This first one is going to address the Phillips curve, what it is, and how it relates to our aggregate demand and aggregate supply models. The next one is going to address the long-run Phillips curve and how it relates. And then the last one is going to be about inflationary expectations and contractionary and expansionary policy. So, a quick history lesson here. We know about our macroeconomic relationship here between short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. I've eliminated long-run aggregate supply for purposes of this video, and you'll see in the next couple of videos why. But what we have here is we have a short-run equilibrium at the intersection of these two curves, and we're going to call that point A. There's a New Zealand-born economist. His name was Phillips, and in 1958 he published his findings about the relationship between wage rates and unemployment in the United Kingdom. And what he found was there was a negative relationship, but we don't really care about wage rates. In fact, we know that wage rates are very closely related to the overall price level, which we can measure by talking about inflation. So the axes here are I and U, the Phillips curve. The relationship between inflation and unemployment. And this is actually a negative relationship. What Phillips found was that as the price level went down and unemployment went up, interestingly enough. You might assume that if the price level went down, that unemployment would go down as well, but he found a negative relationship here. So that's really interesting. This means like policymakers, according to Phillips' original 1958 prediction, policymakers have an interesting choice. They can choose high unemployment at the sacrifice of low inflation, or they can choose high rates of inflation at the cost of low unemployment. So what we have here is an interesting concept. Like, let's say I pick a point on this line and I label it point A. All I really want to do is indicate to you what can happen from this graph to this graph and how we can view macroeconomic relationships on the Phillips curve. What's going to happen over here is going to reflect itself over here. So go back and look at the aggregate demand stuff. What's one reason that aggregate demand could increase? Go back, pause the video, and think about it. Okay, so one reason aggregate demand could increase would be an increase in, let's say, the money supply. If we increase the money supply, we will see an increase in aggregate demand, and we have a new equilibrium point. We'll call it point B. This will be aggregate demand 2. What we see at this point is higher prices, right? We moved from point A to point B, and we've increased output from this point over to this point. We've also increased prices. So what we've done here is when output increases, we see a decrease in unemployment. So we should see a shift this direction. Unemployment should go down, and we also should see an increase in price level, which causes which is reflective of an increase in inflation. So we should see the point move both to the left and up, which means it's going to be at this point on the line. It's worth kind of looking at this like in a mirror relationship. If that's one way that you can remember this, then by all means, please do. That's how I remember a lot of this. These two curves are mirrors of each other, or these two graphs are mirrors of each other. As A moved to point B, A here moved to point B. And you're going to see this happen again when we move the curves again. Let's say that aggregate demand actually decreased, and we moved from point B to point A. You can see here, as we move from point B to point A, we moved down the curve. So it's another mirrored relationship. But let's say we don't change aggregate demand. Let's say we change supply. That will be interesting. What happens if we change supply? What's one of the reasons why supply can change? Go back and look at your videos from last chapter. Why would supply change? Would we see an increase in supply if, let's say that an increase in supply, we're going to deal with specifically with that. Pause the video and go back and look at that. Let's assume that short-run aggregate supply increases due to a decrease in business taxes that allows for increased production. If we see that, then we should move the supply curve, and we actually go from point A to point B. We're going to name this one point B as well. So let's think about what we just saw on this curve when short-run aggregate supply shifts from curve 1 to curve 2. We see a decrease in the overall price level and an increase in output, which means that if we move from point A, output goes up, which means unemployment goes down. So unemployment is going to shift, like we're going to move point A, it's going to go left, we know that. But price level also went down, so it's actually going to go down this way as well. So I'm not going to match the curve. I'm going to be somewhere like here. How does that make sense? Well, what you have, whenever you see a shift in supply, all the determinants for a shift in supply also shift the Phillips curve. Remember the mirror thing? An increase in supply indicates to you that there's going to be a shift inward of the Phillips curve. I mean, again, mirror images here. The opposite would be true. If supply decreased, you would see a shift outward of the Phillips curve. So that's how the Phillips curve relates to aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply. In the next video, we're going to talk about the long-run Phillips curve and what the Phillips curve kind of looks like today.